The story of Kush begins with a contradiction that feels impossible to forget. A civilization rose and ruled pharaohs, yet its name disappeared from familiar histories for centuries, leaving behind stones and questions. This video will pry open the sand to find a proud empire, whose kings walked between African deserts and Egyptian courts. Geography shaped Kush in ways that defined its power and identity. Nubia lay to the south of Egypt, a stretch of river, desert, and cataracts that created both barriers and corridors for trade, movement, and war. Those cataracts became the spine of a civilization that relied on both isolation and connection to thrive across millennia. Long before the famous pharaohs of Egypt looked south, complex societies existed in Nubia with their own chiefs and kings. The Kerma culture rose with monumental mud brick structures, trade networks, and skilled artisans who worked gold, ivory, and pottery. These developments made Nubia a source of wealth and talent that would forever alter the balance of power with neighboring Egypt. Egypt and Nubia engaged in a long, complex dance that blurred the edges between conqueror and collaborator. For centuries, Egyptians pushed south to control trade and resources, while Nubians adapted, and resisted Egyptian influence with their own pride and innovation. This interplay set the stage for a reversal of fortunes, when Nubia would not merely resist Egypt, but rule it. From this crucible emerged Napata, the religious and political heart of early Kushite power. Situated near Jebel Barkal, Napata became a spiritual center dominated by temples to Amun and royal tombs that announced legitimacy. The city served as a bridge between desert caravan routes and the Nile corridor, allowing Kushite rulers to project influence across a diverse landscape. Religion formed the ideological backbone of Kushite rule, and the god Amun became central to royal legitimacy. Kushite kings embraced Egyptian symbolism and priesthood structures, while infusing them with Nubian meanings tied to the river and the land. This religious fusion allowed Kushite rulers to claim divine right and to be accepted by Egyptian elites when the opportunity arose. The turning point came with Pi, the Kushite prince who marched north to alter history. His campaign did not arrive as a clumsy invasion, but as a carefully orchestrated assertion of moral and religious authority across fracturing Egyptian territories. Pi announced that the time had come for the South to reunite the country, and his inscriptions framed his conquest as both divine mandate and political necessity. Pi's campaign culminated in the siege and submission of powerful northern lords who had fractured Egypt into competing kingdoms. His victory was as much religious and symbolic as it was military, with temples and priests legitimizing his claim to pharaonic power. The inscriptions he left at Napata provide a rare first-person narrative from a Nubian perspective that scholars still study for how it frames conquest and kingship. With Pi, success came the rise of the 25th Dynasty, a period when Kushite pharaohs ruled over a unified Nile valley. These rulers sought to restore Egyptian prestige by refurbishing temples, sponsoring monumental art, and defending traditional cults against foreign intrusion. Their reign demonstrates how a southern power could not only conquer, but also become an authentic bearer of Egyptian kingship traditions. Teharka stands out among Kushite pharaohs as a ruler whose ambitions crossed borders and eras. He expanded infrastructure, engaged in international diplomacy, and confronted formidable powers like Assyria in a struggle for regional dominance. Teharka's reign left substantial building projects and inscriptions that point to a king who combined military courage with intellectual and spiritual devotion. Kushite art and culture developed their own distinct flavor that blended Egyptian formality with Nubian sensibilities. Sculptors favored elongated faces and lively gestures, while craftsmen produced jewelry and pottery that displayed unique regional motifs. This cultural synthesis gave Kush its trademark identity, a hybrid aesthetic that spoke both of continuity and innovation in the Nile world. Royal burials in Kush took on a striking architectural vocabulary, with steep pyramids and distinctive tomb chapels. These pyramids were smaller than those of Egypt, but more numerous, clustered in cemeteries that doubled as statements of lineage and power. Each tomb complex served as an eternal theater where rituals, offerings, and royal memory converged to sustain a king's presence beyond death. The story turned again when Assyria entered the stage with iron weapons, new tactics, and imperial ambition directed at Egypt. Assyrian pressure broke the dream of sustained Kushite rule in the north and forced a strategic withdrawal to safer southern territories. The Kushites adapted, however, transforming displacement into renewal by shifting their center of gravity to Meroe. Meroe became the forge of a new Kushite era where industry, trade, and culture flourished away from Egyptian oversight. Located deeper into the Sudanese savanna, Meroe capitalized on iron deposits, caravan routes, and a unique ecological setting that fostered innovation. The city evolved into a cosmopolitan center where African, Mediterranean, and Red Sea influences intersected in marketplaces and workshops. One of Meroe's greatest mysteries is the Meroitic script that scholars still struggle to fully understand today. The script represents a vibrant written culture with inscriptions on monuments, stelae, and everyday objects indicating a literate elite and administrative complexity. Though partially deciphered, Meroitic writing remains a tantalizing key to unlocking more intimate details about Kushite governance, religion, and daily life. Meroe's iron industry provided the kingdom with both weaponry and trade goods that financed its prosperity. Skilled smiths ran furnaces that turned local ore into tools, nails, and swords that were traded across the Red Sea and into the African interior. Control of iron not only offered military advantages, but also underpinned agricultural expansion and urban development across the kingdom. Trade networks stretched Kush's influence from the Mediterranean down into sub-Saharan Africa and across the Red Sea toward Arabia. Commodities like gold, ivory, and iron flowed through Kushite hands, while exotic goods and ideas moved into Meroe's markets and temples. These channels made Kush not a provincial backwater, but a player in early globalized exchange systems of the ancient world. Architectural achievements in Kush borrowed Egyptian models, but adapted them to local climates, materials, and aesthetics. Temple facades often bore lotus and papyrus motifs, while Nubian columns and sandstone reliefs added regional flavor. These buildings anchored religious life and state authority while standing as material evidence of a society that blended imitation with independent innovation. Assyria's arrival did not only topple kings, it reshaped the geopolitical contours of Northeast Africa for generations. The military campaigns from the north exposed Kush to new dangers and redirected its political ambitions away from Egypt. Yet this trauma also forced creative responses, as rulers like those at Meroe reimagined statecraft through trade, metallurgy, and regional alliances. Kush maintained relationships with neighboring African polities through diplomacy, marriage, and trade that extended influence beyond the Nile. These connections underscored how Kushite power was not merely military, but also social and economic, knitting together diverse communities across savanna and river. The kingdom's long-term stability relied on these networks, which provided resources, manpower, and cultural exchange. Remarkably, women played prominent political roles in Kushite society, including the famous title Candake, often translated as Candace. These royal women were not symbolic ornaments, but active rulers and military leaders who could command armies and preside over state rituals. The presence of powerful female figures in Kush challenges many assumptions about gendered power in the ancient world and offers lessons about alternative political traditions. To understand Kushite daily life is to imagine vibrant cities, skilled artisans, and bustling riverine markets that supplied a sophisticated urban culture. Houses, workshops, and temples created a rhythm of work and ritual that sustained families and supported state projects. This everyday world produced the artisanship, literacy, and administrative records that allowed Kush to endure through centuries of upheaval and change. Like many great cultures, Kush eventually faced environmental and economic pressures that eroded its foundations and led toward decline. Diminishing trade, shifting climate patterns, and internal social changes combined over centuries to weaken Meroe's ability to sustain large state projects. The fall was not sudden, but rather a drawn-out attrition that left monumental ruins and puzzled outsiders for generations. European explorers and archaeologists rediscovered Kush in the 19th century, but their interpretations were often filtered through colonial biases. Early excavations prioritized spectacular objects and imperial narratives while downplaying indigenous continuity and complexity. Modern archaeology has begun to correct these distortions by situating Kush within African and global histories, rather than treating it as a curiosity to be plundered. Today, Africans and global scholars alike are reclaiming Kush as a foundational chapter in continental history and identity. Museums, universities, and local communities are collaborating to repatriate artifacts, reinterpret sites, and revitalize ancient knowledge systems. This process of recovery is not merely academic, but deeply political, reconnecting living cultures with ancestral achievements that shape modern identity. Kush's influence extended into neighboring states and later African civilizations through artistic styles, religious forms, and political models. Kings and courtiers borrowed Kushite motifs, while traders carried its goods into distant markets, creating cultural ripples across the continent. These threads demonstrate that Kush was not an isolated kingdom, but a central node in a web of African exchanges that persisted long after its political power waned. Many misconceptions have obscured Kush, including the idea that it was merely a pale imitation of Egypt rather than a creative partner. Scholarship is peeling back those myths by emphasizing original contributions in metallurgy, architecture, and governance that were uniquely Kushite. Correcting those misconceptions matters because it reshapes how we understand regional power, technological diffusion, and African agency in ancient history. The legacy of Kush raises profound questions about who writes history and what gets remembered or forgotten. The reclamation of Kush within Pan-African narratives challenges older frames that marginalize African states and insists on a more balanced global history. In examining Kush, we are reminded that memory is not accidental but constructed, and that recovering lost pasts requires persistent curiosity and political will. Kush offers practical lessons for modern states about resilience, adaptation, and cultural synthesis under pressure. Its kings shifted strategies between military conquest, religious legitimacy, and economic innovation to survive changing circumstances. These historical choices show how societies can respond creatively to ecological constraints, external threats, and opportunities for trade. As we look toward the future, Kush provides a model for honoring indigenous knowledge and integrating it into contemporary development. Archaeological and cultural revival can support education, tourism, and local economies without commodifying heritage or erasing complexities. The path forward involves mindfulness, collaboration, and respect for the living descendants of ancient civilizations. When we finally place Kush back into the wider narrative of world history, the picture of the ancient Nile becomes far richer and more interesting. Kush was not an appendage, but a partner, competitor, and innovator whose story complicates tidy categories about civilization and technology. Reintegrating Kush challenges our assumptions about historical progress and reveals the deep interconnectedness of African and Mediterranean worlds. The philosophers and students of history can draw a simple ethical lesson from Kush about remembering the overlooked and valuing forgotten voices. Societies that forget are vulnerable to repeating past erasures and injustices, while societies that remember gain richness and moral clarity. The recuperation of Kush therefore matters for ethics as much as for chronology, urging broader empathy across time and place. In the ruins of pyramids and the slag of iron furnaces, Kush whispers a story of adaptation, creativity, and power reclaimed from obscurity. Its kings once wore the double crown and spoke the language of gods, and its craftsmen forged tools that shifted economies across regions. To listen to Kush is to broaden our sense of who mattered in antiquity, and to accept that greatness can bloom in many soils. If this retelling of Kush has given you a new perspective on African history, then you are not alone in that surprise or curiosity. History is not a fixed monument, but an open archive waiting for interpreters, and every recovered story reshapes how we conceive of past human possibilities. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe to keep exploring forgotten empires and big historical questions together.